For ad-free access to thousands of shows you'll really enjoy. And welcome back to Coast, George Noory with you. John Hogue, one of our favorite guests, back with us, writing on the subjects of the occult, parapsychology, mysticism. He is considered, no question about it, a world authority on Nostradamus, a best-selling author. His work has brought him international acclaim. His website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. I understand, and we'll talk about it a little bit later on tonight because John's with us for a couple hours, that he's beginning to do readings again. John, what a time we are living in, my friend. Whoa.
Did I not tell you that the roaring 2020s would roar?
I didn't expect them to roar this quickly, this fast.
Neither did I.
Gosh.
But it's almost like in New Year's, I mean, we've already had two brushes with the war with Iran, the coronavirus, the oil recession that is really what's going on beyond all the panic about the coronavirus that happened on the 9th of March. Significant things changing the future for us.
Well, I got to tell you, John, I thought when we talked back in December that the roaring 20s would be the election. I think that's just a small part of it now.
And it almost has disappeared from the scene, which is another thing of the roaring 2020s. It roars certain things right out of the picture. Like, who's even thinking about the election pretty much right now? Remember all these years I used to tell you that we'd enter each new year of the 21st century, and more, especially by the 2020s, we'd go to sleep one night and wake up and the whole world changed the next morning.
Yeah. John, before we get into Nostradamus and some of his prophecies, I want to get your perspective because I respect you and you think things through. The media, I think they're creating hysteria. The seasonal flu, even though this coronavirus is the flu on steroids, the seasonal flu kills upwards of 60,000 people a year. I don't think this is even going to get close to it. But the media never reported that. Those statistics about the seasonal flu, I had to get from the CDC because the mainstream media never did daily reports. Hey, folks, 500 people died from the flu today. They don't do that. But on this one, it's every day, and people are going crazy over this. Why?
Well, in my early Hogue Prophecy articles, when it looked like in early January that this was coming up, and then in February I reported saying this is a plague of fear. It's not a real plague. And I actually quoted all those numbers about the average flu deaths around the world, which is sometimes between 600,000 to 800,000 people. That this, though highly contagious, like some other flus that I personally experienced as I grew up in my 65th orbit around the sun so far, that I felt the panic in this was far, far worse than the reality. I even said then that I thought that maybe the death toll in America would be in the low thousands at maximum, but I thought I was overstating it. But then when it came here, this is the first significant national emergency I've lived through where the partisanism that has overtaken, talk about a plague, the plague upon the media that has gotten into tribal, partisan, red on blue hysteria. This is the real plague. And, we'll talk about what's happening also shadowing this is a more important story, is the economy.
Yes.
But even just recently when I was voicing this in my COVID-19 report to my own readers, it was amazing to see where I said, look, when I sensed that the president was talking about not killing the baby with the bathwater, or what I called in the theme of the article, to save American lives, do not sacrifice the American life. If you undermine the economy, at a certain point, people are going to have to move. The Chinese did it. They started in February, even when Wuhan was at its worst. And I have a very strong feeling that the president's going to come out of this much stronger than he went into it. and that
I think you're
he's
right.
made the first very bold executive decision, very risky, but I think he's thought about it hard, and he understands, and I think his intuition is right about this. And I would imagine that he might not get the 19th of April, but by May, I think we'll start seeing some of the economy starting back into gear, just like what happened in China. Outside of Hubei province, Wuhan, there'll be a slow retooling, and that will encourage things. And then we'll have to look at what really the damage is.
Absolutely. And I still contend this was made in some viral lab in China. That's my guess. That's my gut. What do you think?
Well, there's there are. We'll talk a little later about Nostradamus' prophecies that are elusive, but certainly some of his plagues are plagues that sound like bioweapons.
They sure do.
And so I have not made a conclusion. I'm still investigating it. But, the fact that there is a major weapons biological research lab in Wuhan, and although I think, even though the Chinese were withholding information, I think a lot of people in the media have, especially the pro-Trump part of the media, are kind of moving too fast and thinking that this cover-up was to hide anything more than perhaps saving face.
Well, as you know, John, I don't believe in coincidences. And as soon as I found out that in Wuhan they had this weapons lab there that they have genetically worked on and tested things, to me it's one of those, there's no way this could just accidentally happen this way.
Well, actually, the thing that's intriguing about this, because, a lot of really virulent diseases are, for instance, Salisbury has Novichok. A lot of countries have Novichok in their labs. We do. So to say the Russians did it with the poisonings of the two people, the Skripals, is really not covered. And the fact that it happened so near Salisbury, where the main labs in England are, is kind of spurious. The other thing I would cite is there was a person who sent by mistake high, very serious infective biological elements in an unprotected package from one major lab to the other in the United States. So stupidity is also the conspirator in this.
And the TSA and Homeland Security arrested someone from China in the United States trying to carry vials of something through customs.
Yeah, I could.
You can't write this.
Stories of this. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing we haven't had one of these vials drop and start something, and
oh my God,
we have.
My God, I want to talk after the break about Nostradamus. We'll have you give us a little overview of just who he was. He was born in 1503, died in 1566, and you've interpreted his quatrains, his writings, and they're pretty prophetic, and they have been for a long time. And so we'll find out about more of this. John, since you've looked at this, when this started, what was your initial thought?
Well, at first, my initial thought was it was bigger than everybody's making it. And
so you felt that from the get-go.
I did. I thought that, and I wrote about it as early as in February. I started.
Well, you do document your stuff.
I always document everything to just to prove to myself what I get right or wrong, and it's all documented. And it was something I finished at the end of January that got published in early February, and where I just felt my first report was I really don't think this is as big as everybody's saying it. I am much more concerned, and we'll talk a little more further about this, about the inferences to blood plague in Nostradamus, which seem to relate to H1N1. Birds are mentioned, things that, and I've been writing and concerned about that since 2014, when I started writing about one bird flew, FLU, over the human's nest. It was one of my articles at Hogue Prophecy, where we looked at that during the H1N1. I'm worried about a mutation of that, which was the same strain that created family of viruses that created the great influenza of 1918.
Well, we don't want we definitely don't want a mutation, that's for sure. We're going to come back and talk more with John Hogue. We will take calls with John next hour here on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back with John Hogue. John, give us a little overview of the life of Nostradamus and how he was able to have these incredible prophetic things that he talked about in his quatrains.
Well, Nostradamus was born in 1503. His family lived in Provence. There was just a year or so before he was born, his family had to choose to convert to Christianity because they were Jews, Sephardic Jews from Spain. Probably came to the French region in the previous Inquisition wave of fear that happened at the end of the 1300s, rather than the famous Spanish Inquisition that happened at the end of the 1400s. And so they were either grain dealers or physicians, his family. He had a tremendous aptitude for astrology. It was probably the reason why he became a healer, because it was considered okay to use astrology to look at the humors of the body to plot how to heal people. So he then became this wandering apothecary, and perhaps a official physician later on, although it was kind of not so. It was a wild, wild world of the Renaissance where everything wasn't as organized and as it is now. People were pretty much on their own. And he traveled all over France, healing people. He was a protobotanist. He actually was starting to study and categorize plants, and was fast friends with Scaliger and Agen, who was a early botanist pioneer. They had a falling out. The plague hit. His young children and his wife died. Everybody thought it was some kind of curse of the devil. He was summoned to the church justices at Toulouse, neighboring Toulouse, and he disappeared on his mule with his doctor equipment for 6 years.
Jeez.
And it was one of the classic situations of having a great shock. It often happens in the lives of great seers, that their world is turned upside down, and it triggers a deeper understanding of things that sometimes expresses itself in ability to do unusual psychic things. And in his case, there's apocryphal stories of him showing up in Italy. A bunch of monks were walking down a muddy road, and he suddenly bent in his rich clothes down into the mud before the swineherder, who was just turned into a monk. The other monks looked at him and said, "What are you doing? This man is just a swineherder." And I said, "I must bend a knee to His Holiness." And that's only addressed to the Pope. That man, 40-some years later, became Sixtus V.
Wow.
So he went all through the Renaissance. He got a lot of his magical gear, and he also lived in Marseille, which, unfortunately, sorry everybody who loves Marseille, he said he hated the city, but it was a place where he was a port where he could get all the books from the Mediterranean. A lot of people thought that he went all over the Mediterranean. It's a wonderful Hollywood story, but the truth is he could have gotten everything he needed as a scholar from the bookstands of Marseille. He was practicing with Louis Serre, a very good apothecary physician, and then there was this huge flood in 1545 that went through Provence and was a historic flood, and when it dried out in the spring, the most virulent attack of bubonic plague in the 16th century hit Provence. This is the same plague, the Black Death, that happened in the 1300s that killed half of Europe. And they called it le charbon, the carbons, because the lymphatic eruptions of these boils that are famous for bubonic plague go black, and so the Provençal people call it le charbon, the carbons. And he was summoned out of Marseille to Aix-en-Provence, which was the capital of Provence, to administer the sick there. When he got there, he assembled as many of the people he could who are still alive, apothecaries, medicine people, and they went to the main Hotel de Ville and set up their headquarters. And then he did many of the things that people are doing now during this coronavirus. It was his main successful thing was to be very, very vigilant in sequestering people, not people having them gather in crowds. That, he, as even though he made a very famous prediction that kind of indicates he had, at least under trance, a vision of germs causing disease, his actual practices were more classical Roman and Greek hypocrisy things. And so 270 days he fought the plague almost single-handed, sequestering people, but unlike what they would do where they had everybody taped away and the windows battened down so their foul humors of the plague couldn't catch people, he would open the windows up, because the one thing he did that was quite positive was he was into hygiene. He was into cleanliness. Now, people used to think, common sense, okay, the people who bathed once a year and thought they were clean freaks in 1600s, or the 1500s, one thinks then that he must have saw hygiene in the future. But when I studied him and wrote my biography, Nostradamus, A Life and Myth, I saw that he was actually following Roman Galen, the father of Roman medicine, and Greek medicine, modern medicine, which were really into clean water, clean food, cleanliness. They don't know why it worked, but there's a lot of things that the people of the past understood that they might not have known it was a germ, but they knew that when rats were around, you got to kill all the rats. They knew that all the way back into the Bible. You see passages in the Bible about that. Kill the rats when there's plague. That the things that stink and foul and are foul are not things to mix with, to be clean, to stay away from each other for a while. Let the winter come. And because these often happen in the summer, the bubonic plague was much worse. And so he ended up helping the people of Aix, and then he went off to Lyon to fight another kind of plague called the whooping cough. And this is the thing that's important for what we're going to talk about in these prophecies, is Nostradamus. A lot of things that you got to think like a 16th century person, not try to impose your 21st century bias on his prophecies, as most people who write about him do. And many things, even the common cold is a kind of plague, pestilence. So this is important because there's a number of things he talks about in his prophecies that he calls a plague that we might call radiation sickness.
Right, okay.
Things like that. So anyway, he ended up semi-retired doctor when he was in his 40s. He married probably somebody who was a young widow of somebody he couldn't save in Salon-Provence. And he moved to Salon-Provence, built a third floor on his house, and that's where he created his secret study. He did one more long trip to Florence, the capital of knowledge of the Renaissance, and got whatever he needed there, equipment and stuff, to start his history of the future gazing.
Let me ask you about social media, too, John, because there's something running around social media that attributes this coronavirus to Nostradamus directly. Have you seen it? Is it accurate?
Yeah. No, it's a classic example of what frauds do, hoping that you just don't know. For instance, when he says it's the twin year.
That's right.
And most of these are sourced to British newspapers, but for instance, the twin year.
Twin year would be 2020 to me, right?
Yeah, which is common sense, and that's how these cons con people. I mean, it makes sense. It's an innocent thing to assume. But what about 1818? What about 1919?
1919, that's right.
What about hundreds of numbers, including 3030? And then the other thing, too, is he calls the corona, and then makes a translation, which is crazy. He calls corona a queen. Or queen. The term queen is corona. Coron is a crown. And he uses the world economy will collapse. Well, it shows that, when I look at Nostradamus' French, because I read his 16th century French and all the languages he uses, and I have a database which looks at everything he used. And he never used économe or économie in any of his works. And the way it was used back in his time was being frugal, economic. It was a very different term than, ironically, now where economy is synonymous with waste and inflation and all that. Now it's very words change their meaning, and that's very important. So yeah, the most important thing I want to tell everybody out there is that Nostradamus dated not dated. He indexed all of his prophecies. They have numbers and sources. He must have seen, in fact, it was happening in his own time. He was arrested in Marseille in the early 1560s after he became famous for his prophecies. And he was far more famous than like Edgar Cayce or Gene Dixon were. He was the talk of the courts of Europe.
And this was without media or social media.
Well, you see, the thing that's intriguing with Nostradamus is he is a figure, an early best-selling author of the last great information revolution that happened 500 years ago with the printing press. And so it's fortunate for anybody who studies him is that almost everything he wrote survived because there were so many copies of it, because he was highly successful. His almanacs kind of created the genre. And which also had prophecies about local issues in France, and then in 1554, 1555, he was very concerned about the coming of a potential civil war, religious civil wars, and between Protestants and Catholics in France, dealing with the death of the king in a jousting accident. So he was actually, because he made that dangerous prediction, became the talk of the court. He was summoned to the King and Queen of France, mainly because of the Queen, who was also from Florence.
She was a supporter of his,
She was
right?
a Medici. She was one, the family that ruled Florence. She became his occult confidant, and saved him actually a few times because ironically, and I mean, there are things that happen in my life that are kind of, I have to chuckle and say, well, this is similar to what happened with Nostradamus, is that people thought on both sides of the Civil War that he couldn't stop, which he very accurately predicted in his further prophecies, that he was, if the Calvinists thought he was a Catholic agent, the Catholics thought he was a Protestant Calvin firebrand, and I wouldn't even put it past the fact that some knowledge of him once being born a Jew might have also caused him some trouble. But he has a distinction. It's rare of prophets. He died peacefully in his bed, a rich man. He also, by the way, just so I don't get these letters anymore from people who don't read about Nostradamus, I constantly get letters from Nostradamus never asked for any money to do any prophecies. And so, well, Nostradamus was a businessman, and his business was prophecy. He never did anything for free.
It was the business of prophecy for him.
It was his profession. It's like a grocer. You're going to go to a grocer and say, "Oh, just give me the food. You're doing religious work, and therefore you should be poor and just give me the food and not be able to run your grocery shop." So he was this, and he. In the end of his life, the Queen, who was the regent, because of the very things he foresaw, the Queen Regent came on her great tour of the realm to placate all the disruption, because the first of 9 civil wars happened. She made a point to see him first, go down to Provence, and in public give him honors so that the people would stop persecuting him in his own town. And then he ended up dying, and he wrote all these prophecies about, a couple of them about, he was really concerned about his bones being disturbed by people, and he put a curse on his tomb, which was in the wall of the church of the Cordeliers, a Franciscan church, not the church that you see now, which is much farther out of town than the church. He was very much into Franciscans. So that alleviates any of the people who think he was into the Knights Templar, even though the Templar church is just down the road. I know, I was there.
Yeah, he converted to Catholicism, didn't he?
Well, his family did.
Okay.
So, but there's very much of the Jewish tradition that, I mean, he was the classic little c Catholic. Katholikos in Greek means universal. And, there's a struggle, which I've often in my own prophecy books about Catholic prophecy and St. Malachi and the last Pope, which I'm upgrading again to update it for Francis and being involved in it. There's this struggle in the church between little c Catholics who see that everything has a Catholic universal connection, and those who are more dogmatic, who try to take all that whole cosmos and jam it through a narrow tube of dogma and dispense it out the straw. And so that's been the struggle of Catholicus since 16 centuries, when the Catholic bishops won out in the Council of Nicaea to organize the church into its organized ways.
Looking at his quatrains, John, and we're coming up to the break, but looking at his quatrains, did he, in your opinion, foretell this coronavirus?
Yeah, there's some interesting, just one of them, Quatrain 75. It's not the ones that are, well, one of them actually was grabbed by the press. It was kind of right. Could be. Quatrain 75, Century 3, Volume 3, actually calls Paul Verona, Vicentia, and Saragossa. It's not just Italy this plague happens, but he's mentioning towns that are standing for countries. That's France, Italy, and Spain.
Well, he hit those.
Yeah, swords damp with blood from distant lands. A very great plague will come with a great scab. Now, that also means shell or pod. Now, I imagine that he would have, because it's done it in other things, it's almost like he has a sense of our media, and look at what symbol is in our heads all the time, that pod with the little stubby fingers. That's the coronavirus.
John, hang with us. We'll come back and talk more and take some calls next on Coast to Coast AM. Thank you for listening to Coast AM on our official YouTube channel. I'm your host, George Norrie, and don't forget to visit the Coast Insider membership area on Coast